Hello and welcome to Faith Backstage, where we are having backstage conversations about faith, life, and ministry. I'm your host, Joey, and I am joined today by Matt Moore. Matt, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Happy Friday. You know, a lot of people, Friday is kind of the best day of the week, the day that they look forward to most. But obviously for pastors, the schedule can be a little different. So what is the day that you look forward to most during the week?
I think it's Fridays.
Yeah.
I love Fridays, going into the weekends. Most of the stress of the week is behind, and Sunday is not the next day. And so I don't have that anticipation for kind of thinking about what I'm going to say or what's going to happen logistically. So I like Fridays too.
Gotcha. Yeah. Do you typically have your whole message kind of written by Friday, or?
No.
Okay.
I mean, I hope to.
Yeah.
Very rarely I do. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, hey, thank you again for being on. I'm really excited to have you. I took a course, an online course that you gave called Untitled Chapter that I really, really enjoyed. So I'm very familiar with you, but we've obviously never talked before. So I just wanted to start by getting to know you a little bit. Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you kind of an icebreaker question. I'm leaving for vacation in just a couple days. And so I wanted to start by asking, what is the best vacation or even just trip that you've ever been on?
Yeah. I mean, should I say I went to Israel? Is that my favorite?
Yeah.
No, I've never been.
Oh.
But I went on I think that's like the Bible answer. But I went to Alaska on a cruise. Actually twice. I went with my in-laws one year, and then I went with my parents and my brother-in-law and sister and their family. And it was just amazing. You're on a ship, and then you're out in the middle of nowhere, just looking at God's untouched creation, and the mountains were just so huge, and you just felt so small. And so I loved that. And one of the best parts of the trip is we left from San Francisco. So the bookends of the trip, you're going under the Golden Gate Bridge, and San Francisco is like my favorite city. I actually go there anytime I just need to reset. And so actually tomorrow, my family and I, along with my sister's family, we're going for the day to San Fran.
Oh, fun.
Yeah.
Wow. That's kind of a crazy day trip. Do you leave early in the day and get back at night?
We're only 2 hours here in Sacramento from San Francisco.
Oh, that's right. Duh. I was thinking you were here.
No, yeah.
That makes much more sense.
Even an hour and a half away, maybe. Yeah.
Okay, so that's like me going to Santa Barbara.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, cool.
Yep.
I actually also did a cruise to Alaska,
Nice.
which was just absolutely lovely. What cities did you hit while you were there?
We hit Juneau and Skagway and Victoria and a couple others, small ones.
Gotcha. That's awesome. And I do have to brag, I actually did get to go to Israel with my church a couple years ago.
Nice.
I went as like the media
That's
guy.
awesome.
Doing all the photos and video and running the blog and stuff. So yeah,
Nice.
it was a blast. Israel, I'm sure that'd be like the trip of a lifetime for you. I'm sure you'd love to get to go.
We actually planned on going right after I graduated from seminary, but then my wife got pregnant, and so we've been in the kid phase and haven't gone.
Yeah.
So maybe someday.
How many kids do you have?
We have 3. I have 2 boys and a little girl, 14, 12, and 10.
Gotcha. Okay, awesome. That's cool. So I want to get to know kind of your personal background, kind of where your story begins. So first of all, where did you grow up?
Yeah, I grew up just outside of Sacramento here. We're in Sacramento where all the freeways come together, and I grew up in one of the suburbs about 30 minutes from here. And that's where I was raised, and that's where I kind of got my first taste of doing ministry.
Okay, cool. That's awesome. I want to get to that. What kind of faith were you raised in? Was it Christian evangelical faith?
Yeah. I think every Sunday we went to church, even if we were sick, it seemed like. And my parents, they were definitely people that walked the faith, and they were really devoted to prayer. And so they modeled that for me growing up.
Awesome. That's really great to hear. So what age did you accept Christ at?
I have this memory of being at a campus or a Billy Graham crusade, and I was up, it was like at a horse track, and I remember my dad went down. I was probably about 5 years old. He went down to be a counselor for people that were coming to know Christ. And I remember asking my mom, what's this all about? What's going on? And she shared the gospel with me. And that's the first memory I have of like responding to the gospel. But I don't know if that's when I came to faith, but that's pretty vivid. It stands out in my mind.
Yeah, for sure. So what would you say kind of was the moment that you really came to faith later in life?
I don't know. I feel like most of my upbringing, I was walking the right way, but maybe not for the right reasons. I was doing the Christian thing, but I don't think my heart was always engaged in it. And I think there was also some contradiction and hypocrisy in my life. It wasn't until I got to college where I was really outside of my parents' home, kind of outside of their oversight, where my faith had to kind of kick in. And I think that's where I began to see my faith in action.
Yeah, totally. So what was your first time doing ministry in a practical, tangible way that you remember?
It wasn't that godly necessarily. So I got done with my freshman year at college, and a pastor called me and said, "Hey, what do you think about being a high school intern for the summer back at my home church?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I don't know." Because I kind of went off to college not wanting to be a pastor. I looked at my youth pastor and I liked him, but I'm like, dude, he drives a broken down car, lives in a small house, doesn't have good stuff. So I went off to college to be an engineer because I wanted to make a lot of money.
Gotcha.
And so it wasn't an appealing opportunity for me, but he's like, "Hey, Matt, you get paid to hang out with some of your friends." And I'm like, "All right, I'll do it." So that was that first summer, and it began to hook me, just the relational aspect of doing ministry. I think up until that point, I had seen the stage aspects of ministry, like doing the music or the message, and I was put off by that just because I wasn't an upfront person. I wasn't somebody that I was nervous. I was shy. I was the guy that would show up late to youth group and leave early. And so I had only seen the spotlight style ministry.
Yeah.
And during that summer, I first started seeing the relational side.
Yeah, totally. I can imagine if that's your only perspective on ministry is people being on a stage in front of people, with that kind of personality, I can see how that would put you off.
Yeah.
So what would you say it was kind of like just the denomination? Like what did worship feel like? What did the teaching feel like? What was kind of the style of that church?
It was interesting. The church I grew up in was Presbyterian, PCUSA. And so they kind of had, doctrinally, they were kind of across the board. We had a Presbyterian pastor, but a Baptist youth pastor. So we got like baptized as a baby, but then we got rebaptized, quote unquote, when we were in high school because we had a Baptist youth pastor. So there was like all this confusion.
Interesting.
But it was very interesting. So that was, and then in college, I worked at a Baptist church as well.
Okay, cool. And how long did you do that for?
I just did that for 3 different summers. So after my freshman, sophomore, junior year, came back, did that. But while I was at college, God was beginning to stir in my heart. And what I was seeing at Cal Poly was there were a lot of successful, big campus ministries where, but all of them kind of had their DNA. You had like the cool kids in this one ministry, and then you had the nerdy ones in this one, or the Bible thumpers in this one. And everybody was kind of divided in these different groups. And there wasn't any college ministries on church campuses or at churches. And so it was, I think, my junior year that God really began to put on my heart the idea of having a worship service where all these different churches came together for an evening Sunday night service. And so with that idea and with the Lord stirring and moving, I began to work on staff at a local church as the college director doing this Sunday night worship ministry.
So looking back at your early days of ministry, what's something that you would have told yourself if you could go back in time and talk to your younger self? What's like a piece of wisdom that you would give him, that you would give yourself?
Man, I almost, I was thinking about that. Like, I almost wish I could hear from my younger self now, because sometimes I think ministry has jaded me. And there was such a purity to the way I was following God and expecting God to move. I remember that often I would go up on this hill behind the church and look over the college town and just pray that God would move and expect God to move, and honestly be surprised if he didn't move. And so there was like this eagerness, this faith, this expectation I had. And so almost I want to go back and talk to my 20-year-old self and kind of get that passion again, that expectation. I I wouldn't want to mess with my mind back then, because I really feel like God was really leading me and showing me a lot.
Okay.
So
Okay. So this is really fascinating to me. I don't want to put words in your mouth, so correct me if this is not what you're saying.
Yeah.
But would you say that you had bigger faith back then in your life?
yeah, totally.
Okay. So kind of walk me through that, because all this time you've been a
Yeah.
pastor, you've been doing ministry, teaching at a Bible college. So what's been kind of the
Yeah.
evolution of your faith over these past years?
Yeah, so back then, it was like expecting God to do big things all the time. It was like from one leap to another, radical steps of faith, and seeing God move. And then it was like I started not seeing God move, or I was asking for the wrong things, or I was just like maybe more of a realist than an idealist. And I think sometimes I think back then there was a naivety to me, and just there was a belief that God not only could but would do anything. And then as time went on, I still believed that God could do anything, but enough time had passed where I'm like, he's not going to do everything I ask. Everything I ask is not necessarily in his will, and bigger and better is not always best for God. And so I think actually, in a weird way, God matured me in a sense, because at that time I was only excited about following God if I was seeing him show up in dramatic ways.
Wow. Yeah.
And now a lot of what I've done in ministry with the Lord, I'm not seeing God show up in big dramatic ways. I'm seeing him show up daily in little ways. So it's like a shift between having faith, following God by faith, big steps of faith, and walking daily in God's faithfulness. So it's a bit of the shift.
That's probably a mentality that a lot of young people have, I would imagine, and then growing older. I think it's more of a maturing of faith. I wouldn't even call it like smaller faith. I would just call it like a more mature faith, a more mature expectation of what God's going to do.
I agree with that.
So eventually you found your way down to Cornerstone Church, down here where I am. I live in Simi Valley. So Cornerstone is kind of a big part of my life. I'm very aware of its presence. So what was the process like getting started there? How did you find them, or how did they find you, whichever way it went?
Yeah, so I was doing the college ministry in San Luis Obispo, and we asked Francis Chan to come up and speak at a college event. And that was probably a year or two before I started working there, and that began the relationship between me and him, where we just kind of stayed in touch after he spoke there. And then I knew I wanted to go down to seminary down in that area, and so I hit him up again and just asked, are there any positions? I'm moving down to the area. And so pretty soon after that, I was hired on as a college intern at Cornerstone.
Gotcha. And what were some of the roles that you had during your time there?
Yeah, I was probably just the truest definition of an associate pastor, doing a little bit of everything. I was leadership development. I was the worship pastor. I was one of the community pastors. I did college ministry, obviously, initially. I was an elder, part of the teaching team. So just a little bit of everything.
Yeah, for sure. So what was the culture like under Francis Chan? What were some of the things that you guys valued as a church with him as a leader?
I mean, that's a big question. I came to Cornerstone because I wanted to plant, and I wanted to see, I wanted to be a pastor like Francis, not necessarily the way that he spoke, but the way that he lived. I saw that he believed the word, and he lived out the word. And so when I came to Cornerstone, I thought I would only be there for a couple of years and then be sent out to plant, but then God kept me around for like 9 years. And the culture of Cornerstone was that of faith, where Francis would get up there and preach, and people would believe it. They would believe God's word. And we saw people, move overseas, move across the country, just change their pattern, change their giving, just live faithfully, live by faith. And so there was just an excitement because you expected God to change his people. You expected God to move. People getting baptized. There was an excitement, not only each weekend, but just throughout the week, getting to see what God was doing. So
yeah, totally. That's awesome. Something that I've heard about that I think was happening at Cornerstone during the time that you were there and when Francis was there was some kind of neighborhood program where it sounds like people were divided up into smaller groups within the church, and it sounds like it was literally divided like by geographical like neighborhoods and streets. Was that kind of how everyone was divided up?
yeah. So we made some mistakes with that, but basically the heart behind it initially was there were all these people coming to Cornerstone and we weren't necessarily connected with one another. We would come together, sit in that auditorium on a Sunday, and then go back out and live like mavericks, individually live out our faith. So it was very much a me, myself, and I, in all best intentions, trying to live out our faith for Jesus. But this idea of y'all or we, like we are his body, we are his bride, we realized that we weren't designed to live this life alone. We were designed to do it together. And so we were thinking, okay, what's the best way for us to kind of yoke up with one another? It's to do it by neighborhood. And so we looked at the database, kind of spread it out all over SEMI and outside SEMI, and began breaking people up into these groups. And defined like East SEMI, Central SEMI, West SEMI, and then outside SEMI, both Ventura County and LA County.
Yeah.
And the idea behind it was just to get people to love their literal neighbor as themselves. Like before we think about what else neighbor means, let's start with our literal neighbor, because there was just some different kind of watershed moments where like one pastor heard from a neighbor saying, there's a lot of you Cornerstone people that live in this neighborhood, but I don't get the impression that any of you guys know each other. And it was like, wow, that's weird. That's really weird. An unbeliever is telling us that's weird.
Yeah.
So we were just like, let's force people at Cornerstone to be in relationship with one another and be on mission. Well, you can't force relationship, and especially when you try to break up SEMI, it's not hard to drive those 8 miles across the valley.
Yeah, right.
It worked really well for outside SEMI because we had people coming from Burbank, Pasadena, Ventura, Camarillo. So when we told people, we want you to do life with other believers from Cornerstone in Camarillo, Ventura, Burbank, Northridge, they're like, yeah, that makes sense.
Totally.
But in SEMI, they're like, dude, I can drive 4 miles to hang out with someone else.
Yeah, totally. That makes sense. So what did the program look like, kind of just like practically, logistically? Like, what is it that people were being encouraged to do? What kind of resources did you have available for them?
Yeah.
Like, what did it look like in practice?
So what it looked like, I'll speak to outside SEMI because I was in charge of the outside SEMI. So Ventura County and LA County. We basically identified an elder qualified man to lead a community of believers. And we tried to commission that dude as an elder, as a pastor, and said, we want you to be not just a small group leader, but we want you to be the shepherd of this community. And so we want you to not only, do the Bible study piece, but begin to promote the one another's, not only in the night that you're meeting, but also throughout the week. And we want you to kind of figure out the mission in your neck of the woods, whatever it may be. Camarillo is going to look different than Burbank. And so it was these semi-autonomous communities. And so then I would drive around throughout the week and disciple those different dudes and encourage them, try to address issues that they were facing, encourage them towards mission and such. And so that's kind of how it started.
Yeah, totally. So what were some of the things, like, what did you learn from it, basically? Like what were some of the things that went well? What are some things that didn't go well? What did God teach you through it?
Yeah. I think a big thing was just deprofessionalizing the pastorate, realizing these dudes, they could do a lot. Obviously they had time constraints, but expecting more of leaders rather than just kind of being able to facilitate a Bible study, expecting them to be shepherds. And so just watching them step up, watching them own something. I think sometimes when we lead others, we're like, okay, we want you to lead this group, and here are the 5 things you need to do. Here's the 5 metrics. And these people are very capable. And so to kind of release them with a vision without specifics, like, we want you to be the body of Christ, to be the expression of the gospel in Camarillo. We watched a lot of these leaders just dream. And some of them became kind of almost mini churches. One of them became an actual church in Burbank. And so some of them kind of stayed Bible study like, and then some of them flourished to be more of like an actual church.
Yeah.
Autonomous church.
Yeah, that's awesome. So eventually you got to be part of a church plant out of Cornerstone, which is really awesome. I know that's something that Cornerstone had a heart for.
Yep.
So what part did you play in that process? And what did it look like for you?
Yeah. So like I had said, I came to Cornerstone, and I wanted to plant. I knew eventually I would plant, but I always thought it was going to be in the suburbs. That's where I'm from, and that's where I thought I was headed. And while at Cornerstone, God began to kind of open my heart and eyes to the nations. And so early on, my wife and I and others were taking mission trips around the world, to the Middle East, to Asia, to Africa, checking out opportunities for cross-cultural things. And then God brought somebody into my life that was really passionate about cross-cultural ministry in the urban context. And he said, Matt, dude, I'm going to pay for you and your wife to go to this conference that kind of opens your eyes to urban ministry. And I'm like, yeah, whatever, not going to do it. He's like, dude, just go. And so I went, and we got back from that conference, and my wife and I were just both like, dude, there's a big need in our own area. Like, there, just in our own backyard, there's a huge need. I keep looking overseas, and there is a need there, but there's a need in our own backyard. And so it was a Monday we got back from the conference. And so that night we prayed, God, if you want us to move to South Central L.A., make it clear to us. The next morning I woke up to an email from a guy that I had never met that grabbed my name off the Cornerstone website and said, does Cornerstone plan on planting any churches in South Central L.A.? And so I'm like, all right, God, I'm listening. And so that began kind of a scouting time, doing some survey trips, driving down to South Central LA. I had never been down there. I'd driven past it on the freeways. But we just saw the need. I wouldn't say we were called to it in the sense of like our hearts were breaking for it. We just saw the need. And so that's what began to lead us that way.
Yeah, totally. When you say need, what exactly does that mean? Like, how do you identify and quantify a need?
So when initially I started praying about church planting, I was thinking the suburbs, and I couldn't find a suburb that needed a church. And so some that might be listening to this podcast might be like, I don't know if I agree with you, which is fine. I think God gives all of us different eyes. But when I was looking at different suburbs, I was like, there are not only a lot of churches, but there are a lot of great churches, and there are a lot of new churches. And also there are a lot of churches that are planning on planting churches in these neighborhoods. So there was just like this saturation of churches. So I was like, well, there's a lot of people lining up to do gospel work in these areas. And then when I heard about the urban areas throughout the United States, it was different. There were a lot of church buildings, but there weren't a lot of churches, and there weren't a lot of people heading that direction. And so to see the need for the gospel, just the holistic needs that a lot of the people in poverty, people that had experienced systemic racism have been through for generations, I was just like, okay, I think, God, that's where you're calling us.
Yeah, totally. That's awesome. And how long was that church plant for you? How long were you doing ministry in that specific way?
I was there for 2 or 3 years, 2.5 years or so.
Okay. And looking back, what lessons did you learn through that process? What did God teach you through it?
A lot. So I went down there eager, excited. And I remember pretty early on, my wife told me, she said, Matt, the pastor you were in Simi Valley is not going to work down here. In Simi Valley, there was a group of people at Cornerstone. There was always leaders to meet with, people to classes to teach. Down there were all these unbelievers, and I didn't know what to do. And so I ended up just hanging out with unbelievers at the park and the school, and God was just moving me into my weakness. The verse that led me down there, actually, Pastor Terry Earwood at Cornerstone said it to me. It's from 2 Corinthians 12 that says, my power is made perfect in weakness. Jesus says that to Paul.
Yeah.
And God was leading me towards weakness. And I was previously operating in my gifts, doing discipleship and teaching and preaching and leading, to be evangelizing, to be in a different culture, to be the only white family in our neighborhood, my kids be the only white kids at their school. There were just all these unknowns. I didn't have any answers. And so God was undoing me. And so my wife, in her saying, Matt, the pastor you were in Simi Valley is not going to work here. There was 15 years of undoing that God had to do that I thought was going to be done in a couple of weeks. I'm like, all right, cool. Let's unlearn this stuff. But I would say if my wife was here on this podcast, she would say that God is still doing some undoing in me.
I love that. That's awesome. Okay, so this kind of brings up an interesting question, though, which is, you talked about doing ministry out of your weakness. And I think a lot of people would say that you should be doing ministry out of your strengths, the strengths that God has given you. So much emphasis is put on spiritual gifts tests and, what has God equipped you to do specifically. Yeah. So do you think we should be doing ministry out of our strengths or our weaknesses?
It's a good question. I don't know that I have the answer to that, but here are some thoughts to consider. Yes, there are the spiritual gifts that God has given us. Spiritual gifts are given for the sake of others, and spiritual gifts are given by God. They're not natural gifts. They're not like, I'm just talented at this. They're literally gifts given by God. So I wouldn't necessarily call them strengths, even though I get how they're called strengths. But what I'm getting at is there is this theme that I see throughout Scripture of where God moves people into their weakness, where God puts us in places where we can't depend upon our own intellect, our own experience. It's in those spaces where I think it's pretty hard to become prideful, and it's pretty often that we see God, because you see God work and you're like, dude, that wasn't me. There was no way that was me, because I know what I'm capable of, and I know the limits, the ceiling, the capacity of me, and that exceeded me. And so I typically encourage people, keep in mind what your gifts are, but at the same time, move to spaces where you're going to be forced to depend upon God rather than just bank upon your intellect and your experience and your gifts.
Yeah, totally. I love that. I think of Moses, not being well spoken, wanting to send someone else in his place to speak on his behalf. So I can definitely see that in Scripture. Okay, so this is probably going to be like my third time asking you this question, but I just think with all your ministry experience, it's a really important question to ask. Again, what did God teach you? What did you learn through the process of planting a church?
I mean, a lot of things. Operating in weakness, I hate that. I honestly hate operating in weakness, but honestly seeing God show up. So that's one thing. I think also doing ministry just for Jesus' sake and people's sake, getting back to just the 2 commandments, love God, love people. I think I was operating in the right motives when I was at Cornerstone. I was checking myself. There were times where I had mixed motives, but just keeping in mind that, okay, what is keeping me going? Is it the feedback after teaching a class or a sermon or after discipling somebody? Or is it really because I'm loving Jesus and I actually sincerely love people? God took me to the story of the Good Samaritan, just with where I felt like I was the priest. I felt like I was the Levite for so long. And God was teaching me it was the compassion that I needed to be led by. At times I would see the need and walk around it, or I would see a need and throw $5 or 5 minutes to it. But compassion was what God was really wanting to teach me.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love that. I can't imagine going into that, kind of situation that you'd feel. I mean, did you feel comfortable, going into that moment in places that you'd never been before, interacting with people that you weren't familiar with?
It was timid. It's almost like showing up to a party if you're an introvert and finding that lampstand that you can kind of stand behind and just. I remember going to a park down there in South L.A. and walking up to some guys that were working out and completely yoked. And I'm not a big guy, but I was like, I'm gonna hang out with these guys. I'm gonna do pull-ups. And within 5 minutes, I was just completely lightheaded and winded and had to leave. Like that kind of is how I felt with everything I did, but I was constantly finding myself praying and saying, God, what now? What now? What now? Ministry was very much following the shepherd, listening to his voice, saying, what do you want me to say? What do you want me to do? Ministry before that was like, I've done this before. I kind of know I got to do my discipling thing. I got to prep my teaching, got to get ready for this thing. Or it was very, I wouldn't say scripted, but it was very much, I had done it before. I knew what to do. The plan was really clear to me. There was no mystery about any of my days. But in South L.A. in the urban area, it was like, God, what are you going to do? I don't know what you're going to do. What do I need to do? What do I need to say?
Yeah, for sure.
So
did ministry there look like, church service, like consistent services that you had? Because a lot of what you've been describing just kind of sounds like walking up to people on the street and talking to them about Jesus. So did you have any kind of like consistent services or gatherings that you offered?
Yeah, it started off just by going to the park, getting our kids involved in the local elementary school. I was a yard duty, showing up. Then I did the parents club, like the PTA. I was on the neighborhood city council as the faith-based representative. So it was just looking at the community, at the needs, and kind of seeing where I would insert myself, and hanging around before school and after school, developing relationships, being kind of creepy and being like, hey, dude, can I take you to lunch? And in fact, one of the guys, I remember him telling me, he's like, Matt, you asked me for a year. We were reflecting on our relationship. He's like, a whole year you kept asking me to go to lunch. And I kept saying no. He's like, because I was watching you. I wanted to see if you were real. And so there was a bit of that where I was just putting myself out there, trying to get to know people. That was the first year. The second year was then starting to have more and more people into our homes as they felt comfortable, and then having some impromptu Bible studies and one-on-one discipleship.
Yeah, totally. So after that was over, did you head back to Cornerstone, or is this you now headed up to be part of a church in Sacramento?
Yeah. As I kind of got going in ministry, there were just some conflicts that I was experiencing internally, and just realizing that setting was just not good for me. For my wife, it was. She loved it like never before. When we were at Cornerstone, she was like, I want to be just more than the pretty voice on stage, because she was a singer. But she never clicked as a pastor wife in that context. She's like, I'm not going to lead women's Bible studies and such. And basically, I remember telling her one time in Simi Valley, I was like, hey, we got to have people over like 4 nights a week. And she's like, no, I'm not going to be the hostess for the most. I'm not going to keep the house that clean and cook that much. But then when we got to South L.A., we had people over 6 nights a week, all uninvited. And so what I saw was my wife came alive in urban ministry, where people just showed up, and like we had kids coming over to our house all the time in South L.A. every day from 3 p.m. to like 6 or 7 p.m. They just came. She loved it. I hated it. Like, I wanted very structured. She loved just you came into my mess, you came into my world, let's just do life. And so there was this conflict I was seeing between my wife and I, where I wanted the more structured ministry and she wanted the more relational ministry. Yet at the same time, we were finding that in South LA, that a lot of the people that we were ministering to were like, it was almost like trauma. Like everybody had these needs and there was almost nobody healthy. And so we transitioned out of LA, and we still wanted to be in an urban area, but we wanted to be in a multi-class neighborhood. In other words, South LA and Sacramento are both multi-ethnic, but we wanted a multi-class where you had people that seemingly had their life together, that weren't bleeding out, but then also people that needed a lot of help, because it almost felt like we were an ambulance down there. Like people were coming to our door and it was like trauma all the time. And we needed a better balance, because I think for me, we were just burning out.
I think this might be kind of an obvious question, but I'd love to hear you talk about it. Do you feel like in the American church or even the global church that we have a tendency to do church with people who look like us?
Yes.
I guess that's kind of an obvious yes, but I'd love to hear you talk on it.
Dude, you are asking questions that are going to, I might be giving some controversial answers. So
no, go for it.
Yes. James 2, Acts 2, Ephesians 2, Galatians 2. You read all these chapter 2s in these different books of the Bible. We have a homogeneous church in America. You look at churches and everybody looks alike, and people go to churches where they see themselves. Like, you look at them and they are part of communities that shop at the same place, vacation in the same place, same types of places. They go to the same types of restaurants. They get along not because they have Jesus in common necessarily. They get along with one another because they are friends with themselves. All their circle of friends are carbon copies of them.
Yeah.
That's not what I see biblically. Biblically, I see James 2, the rich and the poor coming together. Galatians 2, where it was Jew and Gentile coming together. Acts 2, just this beautiful motley crew of people. You don't see that in the church too much. And so, yes, I do think the church needs to be diverse. I do think that is what God's called us to. So I could vamp on that for a long time.
I mean, I have time if you do. So what would you say is like the solution to this problem of the tendency to gather, the homogeneous church, the tendency to gather and congregate and do church with people who look like us?
Yeah, it's not hiring a person of color on staff just to appear to be multi-ethnic or concerned about social issues. I've seen churches. I had an African-American friend of mine. He said, Matt, I'm the hottest commodity in a white church right now. And I'm like, why is that? He's like, because I'm black and I can sing Chris Tomlin. And he's like, our conversation that I had with him, and some African Americans feel this way, is that churches are realizing, homogeneous majority culture churches are realizing that they need to be diverse. And so they're hiring people of color, African Americans, Asians, Hispanics, to be on staff and putting them in a position of prominence, but without any authority. And so they appear to be multi-ethnic, but they're not.
Yeah. Dang, that's crazy.
So they're not necessarily, it's like they're changing the behavior, they're changing the appearance, but not the heart of the church. And so you talk to even some of these African Americans, especially during the George Floyd incident this last year, where they felt like they couldn't be themselves and they couldn't really say what they felt they wanted to say because they knew that they were a part of this majority culture church that wasn't, really wanting to hear what they wanted to say or how they felt about what was happening.
Yeah, that's really crazy. It's really sad.
Yeah.
Where is the hope here? Like, I guess I should just ask as like an individual, what can I do? What can a single person do to kind of fix this problem that we're seeing?
Yeah, I think it's what we do between the hashtags. Somebody in our church, we have a lot of people at our church that are like biracial couples, where one is majority culture and then the other one is a minority. And this wife, she said, what I want us to see is do more stuff between the hashtags. What happens often is when something flares up in the nation, whether it be a police shooting or otherwise, people will all of a sudden start posting on social media. They'll go to a protest. They'll speak up. The pastor will preach on social justice or whatever it may be. I think it's more important to what do we do between the hashtags. So what do I mean by that? I mean thinking differently about the way you see the world, realizing that the way we as majority culture, I'll just speak for the two of us, see the world is not complete, that there's a lot of things that we don't know that we don't know. There's a lot of things that we don't see. And so it's kind of like doing the work. And I don't necessarily think that it's reading the books and getting woke that way, but it's developing relationships with minorities. Not only minorities, but people in different social classes. So it's not only like befriending a homeless person or ministering to a homeless person, but becoming their friend. Like, what would it be like to not just bring a peanut butter and jelly sandwich to the homeless person, but them actually coming to your dinner table and then being part of your small group? Or not just having that token Hispanic or African American or Asian friend, but them being a part of your circle of friends.
Yeah, that's awesome. I really love that.
I think that's the first step for all of us. So
yeah, for sure. So you've obviously done church and done ministry a lot of different ways over the course of your life. What would you say the church should be using as kind of like its yardstick for measuring success? What does a successful church look like in our world today?
Yeah, that's a good question. This is part of the undoing that I had to do in my mind of what healthy ministry was or is. Like, what is the metrics? So in the traditional church, it's butts, buildings, and budgets. Like how many people are there? How big is your budget? How big is your building? Things like that. And for church planting in the urban context, that had to shift for me because we didn't have a lot of butts, we didn't have a good budget, and we had no building. And so I often felt like I was always failing because I was not living up to those three metrics. And so what shifted was just thinking about our values at Hope Church are be with God, live as family, love like Jesus. Those are our values. And those then became our metrics for ministry. Those metrics for myself, my metrics for discipling others. And there's nothing unique about be with God, live as family, love like Jesus. That's be with God, that's our up, our relationship with him. Live as family, that's our in relationship. And then love like Jesus, that's our out, what we're doing with the world. So love God, love people, love the world. And so that became more of my metrics. Like, am I hearing people at Hope talk about experiencing God? Am I hearing those live stories? Like, we do something every Sunday called God Moments, where we start the service and I'm like, all right, let's open mic it. How many of you guys are experiencing God? Tell me by 45 seconds or less, how have you seen God move? And so we do these things called God Moments. And when I'm hearing stories, live real-time stories of how God is moving, I'm like, that's a metric. We're doing well. We're like, God is not just somebody that's on the shelf. He's not just part of our testimony of the past. He's been part of our testimony just this last week. So, for example, that's one of the metrics. Just, am I hearing people experience God? And then the other ones, like live as family, like, are we doing life together? Are we doing the one another's organically? Are we dovetailing the things that we do together? And then love like Jesus in our 8 to 5 and in our after 5. Are we getting to know our neighbors, our coworkers? Are we living like missionaries where God has placed us? And so the more that I headed that direction with my metrics, the more satisfied I was. And then I was praying for things that God wanted. I don't know that God wants more butts always, or buildings, or budgets. But I feel better about myself when I have those things. But I feel more fulfilled when I see the be with God, live as family, love like Jesus in people at the church.
Dang, I love that. I love the distinction of being more fulfilled versus feeling better about yourself, which is not at all what church is about, or any kind of ministry.
Absolutely.
You talked a little bit about discipleship and the importance of discipleship in doing ministry. But I don't want to take it for granted that everybody knows what discipleship like even means or what that looks like. So will you just kind of explain like a biblical perspective of discipleship and what that looks like practically?
Yeah. So what discipleship means, man, this is what got me into ministry. This is what keeps me into ministry with all the highs and lows is discipleship. Like, I love it. So what is discipleship? Obviously, you got the Great Commission, go therefore and make disciples of all nations. So disciples are Jesus followers. One author named Mike Breen has taught me a lot about discipleship. He said this, and I don't know if this is entirely true, but it seemed to be true biblically for me, is that the word disciple seemed to disappear from the New Testament once the gospel kind of left the Jewish areas. And you see talked about, especially like in the pastoral epistles, not the word disciple used, but familial language like son. Like Paul tells Timothy that he's his son in the faith. He doesn't say disciple. He means disciple, but he's using a different term. So when it got to Gentile areas, The term for discipleship was more being a brother, a sister, being a father, a mother. Like you read through the pastoral epistles and that's what you see. You don't see the word disciple as much as you see family relationships. So I've found it to be more successful in trying to get other people to disciple. Like I'm making disciples, so they make disciples, to actually not use that word. I'll use it, but then I'll dismiss it and I'll grab at other words because most people know how to be a brother or a sister to somebody or a father or mother. We kind of know what to do. And I found specifically with my own wife, the more that I talked to her about like, you need to disciple somebody, she was put off by it because she was thinking, I need to teach somebody, walk them through scripture. But the more I talked about, you need to live life, you need to be in the word with them, you need to be living out the word, you need to be a mother to this younger woman, you need to be a sister to this fellow believer. It clicked for her. And so I think most people, discipleship, were put off by it because it almost sounds too structured. It sounds too professionalized. But I think most people know how to do it. But I also think most people aren't doing it.
Oh, yeah, totally. Well, so what was it that got you so excited about discipleship in your life? What was the thing that kind of got you thinking along those lines in terms of how we do church?
Yeah, so when I was in college, I was doing this college ministry, and I was preaching on Sunday night, and we were doing some worship music. And after one of the Sunday nights, a guy came up to me, and I had never met him before, big, intimidating dude. And he looked at me and he's like, I don't know if you know this, but when you open God's word, you don't know what you're talking about. And I was embarrassed, obviously, but I knew he was telling the truth. And so I asked him to go out to lunch with me. And so we had lunch, and I had never heard anyone explain and understand the word as he did. And so I asked him to begin discipling me. And up until that point, all I had experienced of discipleship was like Starbucks discipleship. Like, let's get a coffee, let's talk life, maybe confess a few sins that we're partially struggling with. But it was like 45 minutes, not really in the word. He devoted Mondays to me, Monday evenings, 5-6 hours in the word, walking through the word verse by verse. And he'd be like, Matt, do you understand what I'm telling you? And I'm like, yeah, I think I get it. He's like, no, but can you teach it to others? And I'd be like, no, I can't. He's like, let's go back through it. And so he'd walk me through it again and again. We did that for hours. And then we would go out to Pismo Pier and share the gospel and street preach, and down to Isla Vista in Santa Barbara. And I not only saw the word for the first time explained to me, but then the word lived out. Like, I think there's this piece of discipleship where there's the information piece of it, where we can get in sermons, but then the imitation piece where Jesus told his followers, he told his disciples, follow me. You know, Paul said, imitate me as I imitate Christ. So that was something I had never experienced. And my life began to radically change because of that. Because I had read the books, I had heard the sermons, but to watch the faith lived out in somebody, I was like, this change in me, I want to see in others. And so I used to love to do ministry because of what was taking place on that stage, but I wasn't seeing necessarily changed lives. Were lives changing? Yes. But it was not as fulfilling as doing life with somebody and seeing them get it, and then seeing them live it, and then them do that same thing with others. And so that's what hooked me, and that's what changed me, and that's everything of what Jesus did with discipleship.
Yeah, for sure. It's funny, I was thinking as you were talking, something that I kind of regret looking back at, I grew up in the church. I've been going to the same church my whole life. And looking back at middle school and high school, something I regret is like answering like a question, like the question, like, do you understand? And being like, yes, I get it. Yeah. Maybe, often when I didn't actually understand, or I needed it to be explained to me again, because I think pride got in the way, and yeah. I felt like I wanted to look like I understood the Bible and understood all the ins and outs. the gospel is beautifully simple, but it's also beautifully complex. And so what I've been realizing, really more recently in my life, is that I don't know everything, and there is a lot still out there to learn and understand about God's word and the story that He told, that He's telling through humanity, and not assuming that I understand every aspect of it that there is to understand, because I know that I don't.
Yeah, and there's even a piece that you're bringing up is like, I think people learn it and they kind of know what to believe, like they hear their pastor say it, and so they're like, yeah, that's what I believe. But then to see it for yourself, and then to see it in somebody else, like for me, I didn't know the word. I knew what my pastor said about the word, but I didn't know the word until somebody discipled me. And then to see it lived out, not just lived out through Paul and Peter and John and Jesus, but to see it lived out in my city, in my town, in my circle of friends, that's what began to change me.
Yeah, totally. Something that I wanted to ask you that I've been asking a lot of people lately. It's a question that I'm just really fascinated by, and don't feel like there's like one like true clear answer for. Is just how do you balance appealing to the newcomer versus feeding the regular attender on any given weekend, any given church service? I think it probably should be a balance of both, but I'm curious to hear you kind of describe how the church should balance appealing to those two different kinds of people.
Yeah, so just the definition of church, ecclesia, is the called out ones. So it's specifically by definition, churches to be geared for believers. But does that mean we aren't mindful of the yet to believe? I think we need to be mindful. I think in 1 Corinthians 12, 13, and 14, it kind of speaks to that, where we need to be mindful that the outsiders are going to be looking in, that we have to always be aware that there's going to be the yet to believe as flies on the wall, these wallflowers watching us. And so I think what we do needs to be geared towards believers, but we always need to be mindful that the yet to believe, the seeking, are probably there among us, watching and waiting, and God is using our gathering to draw people to faith.
Yeah, absolutely. We've kind of talked about this a little bit so far, but I'd just be curious to hear if you have any other answers for it. Is just what characteristics do you see in the American church, the modern church of today, that are concerning to you? Things that we need to grow in, things that we need to improve in, just as you look at kind of broadly like the way that we do church and the characteristics that we embody. What are some things that you think the church has room to improve in?
I think there's a lot of good stuff going on, and I think God uses all different types of models. I think every time that I've tried to demonize a model, thinking like that's not right, God's shown me how He's working in that model, and He's humbled me by it. And so I think there's a lot of good stuff going on. And yet I think there is this theme of just the pastor kind of being the centerpiece of so much of it. And I think that's a problem. I don't know if I have a solution to it, but the podcast world, the publishing world, just the architectural design of the church, where you have the pulpit being in the center, this place of prominence. So I think the pastor being too prominent is a problem. And I think that's true across all denominations. I think there is a place for a leader, but the prominence doesn't necessarily seem to be the right place.
Yeah, I definitely feel that. I appreciate the humility that you approach that answer with, of there not being one single model that's going to work best, and honestly, just the reality that church is going to the way that we do church is going to evolve. Our mission isn't changing, but the way that we execute that mission can change over the years, and I think it's important that we be open to that. Totally. And then just what hope do you see for the future?
I think COVID's been good for the church. I think some of the quote unquote non-negotiables, the non-biblical or a-biblical non-negotiables, where we thought that church had to look a certain way in order for people to come have been shaken. Some of those timeless traditions that I wouldn't say are heretical, but they've just like, you always got to have worship music. You always have to have a 45-minute sermon. You have to do this. All that has been shaken. And so I'm excited to see people kind of like pastors to think outside the box and start thinking in the book again. Like, what did God call us to with this church? We know what works and doesn't work to some extent, but really, what is the church supposed to be? And I think there's so many different manifestations of what it could look like, but kind of getting back to the class, that we were in together, what did God call the church to be? All churches, all denominations were called to be the bride of Christ. My bride looks different than other people's bride, but we're all called to be the bride of Christ. We're all called to be the body of Christ, the family God. Families all look different, right? Men's brides look different, but at the core, there's similarity. And so I'm hoping that we can get back to like just what God designed the church to be and not be so focused on some of the things that we've been focused on, whether it be the building, the stage, the program. Those aren't bad, but that has become kind of the main piece of the church. And I don't think that's the way it should be.
Yeah, for sure. So we end each episode of the show by asking for some book recommendations. Any books that have been important or influential in your life. You can feel free to give as many as you want. But what book recommendations do you have for us?
This is funny. So my brother-in-law reads like 2 books a week. I read like 2 books a year. I don't read much. I'm with you. And typically when people ask me that, I just say, I think getting back to the Bible, and that sounds really cliche, but just like being in the Word is the best book to be in. But to answer your question, anything that Tim Keller wrote on the gospel has really changed my perspective. And Jerry Bridges, his latter works, talking about how the gospel has power to change the believer today. Those 2 authors for me have really helped me see how God has a grace available for me today to live the life that he's called me to today. As far as, so that's stuff related to the gospel. As far as things related to discipleship, Mike Breen, he has a book called Building a Discipleship Culture, and then another one called Family on Mission. Both of those have really helped our church understand how to disciple and just what it really looks like, how it's not programmatic and how it's more relational, how it's life on life.
Yeah.
So
sweet. Thank you. Thank you so much for being on the show. This was a real blast for me. Like I said, I really enjoyed the course that you taught, Missional Church, and I just wanted to have a conversation with you. So hopefully it gave people something to think about, maybe some convictions, but I'm hoping it was helpful for them. So thank you for being on.
Thanks, Joey.